Welcome to the Pat Conroy Literary Center. I'm Stella Wickrow. I'm Pat Conroy's granddaughter. I'd like to introduce my, what he wants to say, favorite uncle. Tim Conroy.
I want to welcome you and I thank you for being here. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of the game plan, which is I'm going to kind of run my mouth for about 15 minutes. And then I'm going to shut up and get the wisdom of the room a little bit and talk about this book. And then I want to close at the end, save enough time for read one poem that I wrote about my father. And I want to end with the Great Santini's words, with a letter he wrote to his children about the book. So that's, and I want to try to get you out of here on time. So it's what, 5:32 now, something like that. You know, it's programmed into me to be pretty prompt. You know, police my area, make my bed. So my goal tonight, my really lesson plan, is for y'all to understand in a deep way what Pat meant when he said the Great Santini was the book he was born to write. I want you to go beyond the surface of that. I want you to keep in mind this quote. It's a quote by one of Pat's favorite poets, a Bohemian poet, a German language poet, Rilke. And Rilke said, "The future enters us in order to transform us long before we know it." The future enters us in order to transform us long before we know it. Maybe the time he came to Beaufort. Maybe it was before that when he had the great teacher Joseph Bontet. Maybe it was when he met Eugene Norris or Bill Duffy. Also, you need to know this about my brother Pat. He wanted at first to be a poet more than anything else. My sister Carol, my brother Pat, they wanted to be poets. I ask you this, what could piss off a Marine aviator more than that? So it gives me the second quote I want to bring to you today. It's a quote paraphrasing another poet, Wallace Stevens. And the quote's this: "Imagination presses back against the violence of the world." Think about that. So, to start this, I got to introduce the family a little bit. And I think I'll do it with this photograph here. This photograph was taken 1968. It's after he's graduated from the Citadel. You see in this photograph some things that you probably notice just by looking at it. I'm going to point some things out. The dressed whites, the hero of the story. We refer to him as the Beast, the Great Santini. This is my youngest brother Tom on the first row, freckled face. Always had a toothy grin. Probably his best suntan ever, because we were living near the Pensacola beaches. This is Tim, me, with those glasses, the military glasses, the Coke bottles. My father referred to my eyes as he has bad peepers. And this is my mom, the beautiful angel. Complicated though. look at her suntanned arms and her gentle smile. This is my brother Jim, the other kid in the family with Coke bottles, bad peepers. He always looks a little tense in this picture. And I'll tell you a little story why after I finish. It's my sister Carol, my eldest sister. I'm going to flip to the other side. This is my brother Mike. He was always too short to be on the starting five, but he was a heck of a ball player, very competitive. But he wasn't quite good enough for Santini. My sister Kathy. She looks sweet, beautiful, and she always has been sweet and beautiful. And this is the hero of the story. Broad shoulder. All the expectations of this guy fell on him. Jim and I were never going to be marine aviators. We had bad glasses. Jessica, Kathy, and Carol in that family did not count. They were women growing up in the most paternalistic family you can imagine. Dad discounted them. And it's really, they were probably broken more than anybody. So that's part of the family background. So Jim, I told you I was going to tell you the story about Jim. Jim in Pensacola. I remember he was playing baseball in the 5th grade. I don't know if you know this story, Sandy. It was a night game, and he had never played in a night game. And also, he really didn't start. He wasn't on the starting squad. He would sub some. Well, they needed him to start. He had to play third base. He learned that night he kind of had night blindness. He made 2 errors. Riding back in the car, my father started to go after him about the 2 errors. What the hell were you doing out there? In the back seat of the car, there was a Catholic priest, Father Mack. Didn't stop my father. He slapped Jim in the back seat for making the errors. Slapped him again. And so that's a little background. That's of the family. Good introduction. So I want to tell you this before we kind of get into it. When I reread The Great Santini, I had not read it since 1976. So Terry and I had taken a little road trip, and we had traveled down to Florida, and I ended up finishing the last chapters in a hotel room in Atlanta. And then it occurred to me that I was in a hotel room at the Ellis Hotel, and I was on Peachtree Street. I was 6 miles away from where my father had retired to when he lived in the Darlington Apartments in Atlanta. 6 miles away, I'm reading the last chapter. I knew what was going to happen. I knew Bull Meacham was going to crash. I knew that F8 was going to flame out. I knew he was going to turn that jet away from the town and privilege the families that lived here. And I knew he would crash in the foggy waters off of Ravenel. But I still cried. I still wept. I wept for the fictitious Santini, and then I wept for my real father. Then I wept for the author that wrote that book, in the memory of Pat. I wept for the memory of Mom, and I wept for my brother Tom. And I was filled up with emotion from that book. And so, the other question that occurs to me to ask, is there anybody with professional mental health experience in the room? After this presentation, I may need it. So, I wanted to share that to you. I want to tell you a little bit of the background about why, or maybe when is the better way to say it, he had the idea of writing The Great Santini. After the success of The Water is Wide in 1972, Mom wanted him to come to the officers' wives club at the Marine Corps Air Station to give a talk. And so he was supposed to give a talk about the water is wide in Defusky. And so he addressed the officers' wives that day in a different way. He asked them not to let their husbands beat them and not to let their husbands hit their kids. And he talked about the abuse. And he got such a reaction from that audience. Some of them hated him for exposing that issue, for talking about that issue. And some of them loved him for it. And that was the first sort of inkling he had that he was going to write this book that came in 1972. And that story's in my reading life. The other thing I want you to tell you before we kind of go into a discussion is, man, at the heart of this book, you're seeing in this novel, this first novel by this writer, a storyteller that's emerging with just unbelievable gifts. He tells this story, and we're all riveted by this story he tells. But guess what? I think it kind of shocked him. A lot of critics don't like storytellers. They don't think they're worth much in literature. And he would battle them throughout his writing career. And he would battle that idea that a writer can't be a storyteller. So what do you think? So, one of the other things I want to say before we get to the discussion is he wrote the first 4 chapters of the Great Santini. And he sent it off to his editor, Ann Barrett. And Ann Barrett said, you got to ease up on this character, the Great Santini. Nobody is going to believe, he's not believable. Nobody's that much of a son of a bitch. And so he says he had, and he in fact does, he creates some moments that make Santini more human. And he has to please this editor, to sell this book, to make this character believable for this editor. And he says he has to lie to write the book. So I'm going to transition to a movie scene when we watched the premiere in Beaufort, and the movie ended, and my brother Jim turns to the family and says, Bambi. I just watched Bambi. I'm going to let Pat do a little bit of the talking right now in this audio clip. Really, it's an interview that was done by Ellen Yajin, and Ellen was Bill Emerson's daughter. You may know Bo Emerson, who's a reporter for the Atlanta Constitution. Bill Emerson had a great career in journalism. And so it's sort of one of those weird circles that she ends up talking to Pat in this interview setting, and it never goes anywhere. It never really is produced. So very few people have heard this. And I don't think you've heard this, Sandy.
At Harry's restaurant. They would sit and watch all the activity on the street as people would pass them by shopping. They would tell jokes. They would recite scandals. They would ruin reputation sitting there right there in that front window. So when I was writing the Great Santini, I thought of putting Bull Meacham in there. Dad was always talking about how the Marines and the civilians had to get along, and he thought it was a duty of himself as a Marine to get along with people who lived in the town. And of course, because of his personality, he could never do it. But still, at least it was a theory of his. So one of the ways you name things is I named Hobie's restaurant a friend of mine at the Citadel, Hobie Maservi. Well, I went the first day at the Citadel, when he came up, he said, "My name's Jim Surrey, my friends call me Hobie." And always in writing, when I name things, a lot of times I'll name for friends in the past, for things I'm nostalgic for, towns that have been good to me, or people who have been good to me. A lot of names in all my books are the names of friends of mine.
What about Bertha? Is she a real person from Hobie's School?
But there was somebody told me about a woman who was a postmistress somewhere in the northern part of the state of South Carolina, who used to come in and would call the guys at the restaurant the Dead Packer Club. And I was like, it was hilarious. This woman would do it. Evidently these guys, she made these guys mad for years. But she absolutely did not care about their criticism at all. And she was much tougher than they were. And this went on for years. And then evidently the town was extraordinarily sad when this mean-spirited, good-hearted woman died.
Do you think that the movie fairly represented the book, The Great Santini?
I loved the movie. I was much happier with The Great Santini. And how it...
Wait, say that over. We can't get the screen on your chair.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all.
I thought it represented the spirit of the book much more than Conrad represented the spirit of The Water is Wide. It's funny, The Water is Wide was non-fiction, and they changed more than the producers of The Great Santini changed of a book that was fiction. And I was very happy with what they did with Santini. They had to cut out, but they always have to cut out. They always have to make choices.
What were some of the things that you wish they had cut out?
I would have liked more of Mary Ann. Mary Ann, the sister, was my favorite character in the book. And they cut out too much more of her. No, they cut out too much of her. I'd like to see a lot more of her. I thought she was funny. I thought she was moving. And I'd like to see that relationship between the brother and sister emphasized more than it was in the movie.
Did they do the fight scene in the movie? When Red comes back to the house and
No, they don't do that. I think they were going to do that. That was one of the choices they had to make. What they told me when I got down to Buford, I was watching some of the film being made, and they told me the last scene they cut out was a scene where Mary Ann catches tears in a spoon on the way into Buford and hurls them to her father. And I wanted that scene to be in simply because my sister used to do that. Every time we would move, we'd be going, our car would be packed with these 7 children. We'd always have the largest station wagon ever made in Detroit. We'd be flying down the highway, they would always leave at night. These miserable, uncomfortable trips with the dog, singing songs, and we'd come into these towns. And you realize that the places I was educated were places like Triangle, Virginia, Jacksonville, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina.
Don't take that personally.
I'm lucky I can write, I'm lucky I can read. With some of these, these military towns all have these depressing milieus. You'll drive into them, it's trailer parks.
About 1 more minute.
I mean, it looks like it was designed by a guy with an impoverished imagination. We would go into these towns, and my sister would just completely go crazy. She would say, "Nice town, Dad. This is a great one." We thought Cherry Point was bad, but this place, for one thing, is smaller. And Carol just never could get used to this league, and we moved almost every year.
this book, The Great Santini, is about your family.
Oh yeah, there's no question about it. I could cut out a few of my brothers and sisters, and they always ask, why did you put us in?
My favorite line.
And I was the oldest, and they were babies, and it was hard to say, baby goo-goo, or the 2-year-old said dead. I just did not do that. So I just cut them out. And they have not forgiven me since.
Well, tell me that the Great Santini.
So I think that's a good way to end it, and it's such a great thing to hear his voice. I just love that. And so the rest of the evening, Baby Goo Goo is going to try to hold some sort of sensible discussion. But first, just in terms of the characters of the book, is anybody in the room that's actually a character that may have been based on You want somebody to speak up?
Fortunately, I am.
Yeah. Grace, you want to tell your story?
I'm a wonderful homeroom teacher. I love the idea that Pat used his great imagination, because I certainly hope that was not me. But I do have wonderful memories of Pat coming in that first year. You know, he's still just like he went out with those wonderful cheeks and those shining eyes and smiling. And he says that I embarrassed him forever by making him run for all the offices in the homeroom, and that he lost all of them. He also goes on to describe his history teacher, and that was not me, because I did not teach him history. But none of the things were very flattering, but we all knew that Pat was a wonderful storyteller, and his imagination was magnificent. And you know, but I will have to say that the way history comes back and forth, when the movie was made here, one of my sons had an opportunity to be on the basketball team.
Oh, that's great.
But he refused because he would have had to cut his hair. The other son was an altar boy at the funeral in the National Cemetery, so we can see one of them on film every once in a while.
So, you know, characters' names, you know, Pat, that to me it was really interesting that he said in that little interview that he would name things after people he had met, people that he connected with, and sometimes people he didn't like very much. He would do that. And I had always heard the character name Tumor was chosen because Pat had met this real racist guy, and so he took that name and gave that name to this great character in the Great Santini, Tumor, who transcends in that book. Is an amazing character in that book. But let's just start. Kind of, y'all help me out. Talk about some of your favorite parts in the book and what you connected with. And don't be shy. Baby Goo Goo is here. So y'all all hated the book. Despise the book. Yeah. Yes.
As a former English teacher myself in high school, I really connected with the chapter when he talked about that teacher who was just such a magnificent influence on him. And the way in which he made him all of his characters to me seem so real. And just all the details about him and his relationship with him, and going to the principal and complaining about him, and then the principal saying, "Will you come back, in a couple of weeks?"
And apologize.
Yeah, you'll learn. So I just think, and the use of detail in talking about him was just so intriguing to me.
And the character you're speaking about is Ogden Loring, and he's based on a real life person in Pat's life in that was a teacher, not at Calhoun, but at Beaufort High, Gene Norris, of course. And that character, Mr. Dacus, is based on a real life principal that was at Beaufort High School at the time that Grace was there, Bill Dufford. And Bill Dufford is still alive. He's 93. An amazing person. But I love that. Any coaches in the room? Anybody ever coached? Sure. Yeah. I mean, I loved how he talks about, remember Coach Murphy in the book? Mm-hmm. He talks about Coach Murphy. He doesn't make the Kiwanis Little League baseball team, and he kind of blames it on equipment. I think if I would have had the new glove, I would have made it. And so one of the moments that I think Ann Barrett probably has something to do with it of softening up Santini is Bull Meacham goes to every team to see if they have a vacancy, a spot where Ben, the character, can play. And eventually Coach Murphy takes him in, and he writes this lovely section about the coach and what coaches mean to boys. And it's a beautiful chapter.
Yeah, you let Coach Murphy die without my thanks.
Yeah.
My thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's a gripper.
Yeah. Yes.
I really liked the basketball scenes because obviously basketball was so important to Pat in his younger years, but I kind of felt like Ben was trying to get better and better at basketball in order to get his father's approval, but really it backfired on him because his father didn't want to admit that Ben was better at basketball than he did.
It's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
It's sort of kind of, all of a sudden, everything's in Bull Meacham's life is about to turn upside down because his power is being diminished by his son. And it's just an amazing scene that unfolds. I think he writes about that scene, about watching when the movie's made. I think it's in The Death of Santini, and watching that with the Great Santini, watching that play out and the emotions that go through him, seeing, of course, I have to, as an aside, just say they were, the actors Robert Duvall and Michael Keith were just terrible basketball players. I've never seen anybody dribble so stiffly. And Pat and Dad were good. I mean, they were just awesome. I mean, Pat was a remarkable basketball player. He wasn't gifted. He wasn't that much of a gifted athlete. He just worked his tail off. And I kind of think you can kind of draw that lesson of an athlete practicing every day to get better, to really trace what he did in his writing life, because that's what he did. It wasn't all just miraculous. He worked his fanny off to get better. And he never learned to type, so everything was handwritten, and he had to rewrite everything a million times before he was satisfied with it, until he really, I'll grant you this, he found the magic. He found the poetry. He did. So, what else?
Yeah, I was going to say the relationships that he develops between perhaps even somebody who's been left out, so the tumor, the Sammy, or the person who's
Oh man, that's
not
a good
popular
observation.
person, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
I'm wearing. Anybody know what this is?
let's see.
It's a pin, and it has a dandelion on it. Anybody know what it is? It's the sign for a military brat.
Oh, really?
And I think that's what you're getting at a little bit. Is what we had to do, what Kathy and Jim and I, we all had to do every time when we moved, we had to find people. And so usually the people you find are people on the fringes that are just like you. And so, I mean, I think that's what probably some of that is. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yes.
Well, mine kind of goes along with this, but one of the parts of the book that I found so touching that wasn't addressed in the movie at all was his relationship with Sammy, because his finding a best friend there really seemed different than what had happened to him in any of his previous homes. So it really emphasized that place was more home perhaps than anywhere else he had been.
And was that really Bernie? Sammy was Bernie, or
Can we
not
just
Bernie, or?
can we pretend like I'm not saying yes?
There were some other friends though at that time. There were
yeah.
some other fellows that kind of got pulled into that a little bit.
Grace, you want to speak of that a little
Well,
bit?
of course, I always think of
Yeah.
Randy Randall.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
the first
yeah.
thing. Randy was his friend who
Yeah.
died on the baseball field.
Yeah.
And anyway, there were a lot of kids. And Pat, after that horrible experience in my homeroom where he had to run against all those girls, he became a leader in the school. He was president of his class the senior year, did all kinds of things, and he made a lot of friends. And I think he took a little bit, but yes, Bernie certainly was a part of that. But I think, and when you mentioned Gene Norris, I just got to say that I don't think anybody realized at the time the impact Gene was having on Pat's life.
But
But he was
there's so many little things that Gene did
Oh.
that just added up. you know, it was just,
Well,
it
you
just,
see it in the,
yeah.
you see it in Waters Wide.
Yeah.
The things that Gene emphasized, the music, the literature, all those things that were important to Pat as a teacher as well as.
Well,
Barbara, you were gonna say something?
Yes. Regarding Pat's success in basketball, was it because he loved the game? Was it to impress his father, or a combination of both, do you think? Or other?
Man, you know, it's a really good question. How would you answer that, John? Would you say he loved the game, or was it to impress Dad, or was it just to get out of the house?
no, I think he loved the game.
Yeah.
I don't think you could play it with the passion he played it with without loving the game.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think he wasn't extraordinarily gifted physically, but he sure made up for it in his tenacity, his work ethic on the court.
And you know,
But I wanted to say something about what Grace was talking about. You know, Pat had these, always talked about his mentors.
Mhm.
But then in all of his books, there's a mentor. There's a mentor.
Yeah.
It's a theme that carries through all the way to the last book. You know, the South of Broad. There's a mentoring character all the way through, and I always look for that mentor.
why do you think that's the case?
I just think, I mean, if you think about, we had back in the Citadel days, we talked about leadership. And leadership was defined by, you looked at some guy ahead of you and you kind of liked what he was doing, so he became your leader,
Right.
or a leader. And you look at somebody else and say, I don't like that way that guy does things, so I'm not gonna do what he does. And you're not learning leadership from him, so you're self-selecting your leaders based on the examples you're seeing in front of you. So I think there was enough in Pat's relationship with Don
Yeah.
that he rebelled against it, obviously. And so I think that was, I think that formed a lot of Pat's thoughts on that.
You know, as we go through this discussion, I mean, the arc of where we're gonna end is really at a place where Dad changes, and where Jessica can speak of that when we get there, because he becomes this great, he has this great second act, as Pat would say. But I wanna pose this question: was Pat more father haunted or mother haunted?
That's a good question. Your mother really had a tremendous effect on him, there's no question about that. As far as being an author, she laid the groundwork with all those wonderful books she had him read. I'm gonna say that.
Mother haunted, father haunted.
So we were talking about Prince of Tide, that's saying mother haunted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Great Santini, it almost feels as though it's more father.
That's good, yeah.
I'd say mother though, because he was haunted by the fact he couldn't protect her.
Yeah, well, that's
And,
true.
you know, he loved her and he couldn't do anything to help her. And that last scene where he goes and beats the crap out of his father, I mean, was where it finally all just broke out of him. So, I mean, I think Bull dominated him, but I think he was haunted by his mother and that relationship.
Yeah. I'll tell this story while it kind of popped in my head. A story when they would do signings together. Dad would sign, and Dad had fully embraced the persona of being in this book, and he loved it, and he sort of had figured out a way to spin it a little bit. But people would come up, especially one type character would always come up and just give him a hard time about running over turtles. And that was completely fiction. he never did that. I mean, he might have accidentally done that once or twice, but Pat never told anybody it wasn't fiction. He would say, turtle killer, and turn the person loose on them. And so, I mean, I always just think that's just hilarious, and Pat kind of got even. But anyway, I don't know exactly where I was going with that. It's a good story. It's a good story. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about your mother? I mean, I found her to be such an interesting character.
Well, in the book, the character Lillian, I find the interactions with Mary Ann particularly fascinating. When Lillian confronts Mary Ann about dressing up for the basketball game and humiliates her about, Ben has said you don't look good. He wants you to dress up. And Mary Ann goes, no, Ben would never say that. And that's not Ben, that's you saying that. I mean, what? I mean, that's I think Pat really complicates Pat. In the way he draws that character out really complicates Lily at that point. And the layers of complexity comes out. So what does Mary Ann do? She leaves the kitchen. She leaves the kitchen and she has that great scene with Bull Meacham where she's dancing around the living room and she's singing songs about how she's married a Negro and she's pregnant with Rufus and it's that your grandchild and Bull is just turning the page, reading the paper, trying to ignore it. I think his line is, "Man, you caught a real bad case of the weirds today." It's just a terrific scene, and it just shows. It's like that book. He draws out that character Mary Ann becomes fascinating to me, and because I have a pretty fascinating sister, Carol Conroy. That's where I'm gonna need therapy at the end of this discussion because it becomes so close to life, but then it's not. And the other part that I think is really an interesting scene in the book is the lawn scene, which we would call in Beaufort the Green. The scene where Lillian tells Ben, after the abuse has happened, to go out and find his father, who's drunk on the lawn. Right? So the book is set, in 1962? So here's the confusing thing. For me, as a brother of Pat, that scene in real life does happen, but it doesn't happen until around 68. And so that scene is out of time. And so there's a lot of things in that book that are based on snippets. And this is what I guess I'm saying. This is what a novelist has to do. This is what a fiction writer has to do. They have to take things they know about and really can draw on. And they just pluck it out of time and space and universe and they put it into a story. And that story is their story with all these snippets, but it's fiction, and that's what makes good storytelling.
So, Tim, are you saying that confrontation took place after the Citadel and when Pat was teaching at Beaufort High? Is that
Yes.
when that's
Yes.
when it
And I
occurred?
can tell you that what happens. What is not written about is before that scene takes place, because before that scene, we had gone to a movie on the base and seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And so Dad goes to the O Club and he gets drunk. Well, see, Baby Goo Goo's in 7th grade at this time. So it is plugged out of time. So Baby Goo's in 7th grade. He goes to the O Club. He gets very drunk. And he comes back, Mom, tells him, look, what have you been doing? You've been drinking. Why are you doing this? And he hits her, slaps her in the parking lot, and he's so drunk he falls to his knees. We run to the car. We lock the car door. He has an extra set of keys. Mom's trembling trying to start the car. He gets in first. Slaps her. She goes flying across the seat. So we drive back into town. That's when we get to Pat's house. That's when that scene takes place later that night. And see, I'm not there for the green or the lawn, and Pat's not there for the Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. So Buddy takes that story and uses it. Happy
Was
family.
that in, I know he wrote Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, and I cannot remember if Nate cut that. Jonathan, where's Google?
That scene is in chapter 3 of Death of Santini, and I don't remember if he mentions Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid specifically.
Call the chapter at first, and
It's not, I don't think it's called that now.
there's something that's not quite,
Yeah.
And so that's, I mean, it's just amazing to me, how much of the book does that to me, and impacts me that way, because it's these real scenes that are taken out of context, that, that are plugged into a different timeline. And so, let's shift from talking about favorite parts to some of the themes that we could draw out in this book. And one of the themes I kind of love to want to explore with y'all is the theme of faith. I mean, what do y'all think about the faith in this book? What sort of theology comes out in this book? What is the author, through his characters, right? Okay. Margaret, you got something here?
As I just told Lori, I wish I could remember. I have not reread Santini in decades. I just came to see you talk.
No, I'll tell you what.
Plus, I keep confusing it with the movie.
No, I tell you, I'll read this section,
Yes,
and to me, it blows me away. It just, I can't tell you when I get, and this is what I did in the hotel room. This is what got me probably the most. So I'm gonna roll with it. It's about a page and a half, because I can't decide what to cut out. Right? 25 miles of highway passed without his knowledge. 25 miles vanished because Ben had retreated to the land behind the eyes again. The children of violent men developed vivid powers of fantasy. Ben Meacham wanted to pray, but he was afraid he was not worthy of prayer. Yet he had a belief and wonder. In the next 25 miles of black Carolina highway, he thought. Can a boy begin a prayer with the hatred of his father in his heart? Can that boy walk up to the altar of God, and can he lay that hatred out? Can he spew his hate and tell his story? Can he tell about the beatings and humiliations? Can he tell of the Marine who stormed the beaches of his childhood? Can he look into the eye of God and spit into the purest sort of light for engendering his soul in the seed of a father who did not know the secret of tenderness, a father who loved in strange, undecipherable ways, a father who did not know how to love, a father who did not know how to try? And what would this God be like? This God of Ben Meacham, this God that Ben was losing fast and barely believed in. In the privacy of the next 100 miles, Ben thought about the kind of God he would approach, that the God would have to look a certain way. In his mind, Ben began to assemble the God he would speak to about his father. This would be the God of Ben Meacham. You ready for this? It's just incredible. Ben would give him the sweetness of Lillian, the dark, honest eyes of Arabelle, the soft virility of Mr. Dawkins, the birthmark of Pinky on his throat, and Ogden Loring's upcountry drawl. Ben would give him the shoulders of Virgil Hedgepath, the innocence of Karen, the spoon and tears of Mary Ann, the high-pitched laugh of Sammy, Matt's intensity, and the loyalty of the Gray. And Ben would put this God on a street like River Street, and he would have this God lift his voice in the holy song of Tumor. The hands of this God would be bright with flowers that would never die, and this God would sing and stutter and limp along an alleyway and pass judgment in the land beside the river. He would hold mercy in a bouquet of azaleas, and he would listen to Ben. On the 16th mile, Ben could see this God as he crossed the Savannah River into Georgia. He would see him in the canvas of his eye, in the brilliant kingdom of his eye. This God was leaning back against the wall of Hobie's restaurant, dazzling the universe with the beauty of Tumor's song. Ben would interrupt this God, and this God would not mind. And can one boy who has said 10,000 times in secret monologues, I hate you, as his father passed him, can this boy approach this singing God, and can he look into the eye of God and confess this sin, and have that God say to him in the thunder that is the perfect truth that the boy has not come to talk to him about the hatred of his father, but has come to talk about the mysteries that only gods can interpret, that only gods can translate? Can there be a translation by this God, all strong and embarrassed, all awkward and kind? Can he smile as he says it? How wonderful the smile of God as he talks to a boy, and the translation of a boy screaming, I hate you, to his father who cannot hear him would be simple for such a God, simple, direct, and transferable to all men, all women, all people of all nations of the earth. But Ben knew the translation and let the God off with a smile. Let him go back to his song, back to his flowers on River Street. In the secret eye behind his eyes, in Ben's true empire, he heard and saw and knew. And for the flight-jacketed boy on the road to Atlanta, he filled up for the first time. He filled up even though he knew the hatred would return, but for now he filled up as if he would burst. Ben Meacham filled up on the road to Atlanta with the love of his father, with the love of Santini. Son of a bitch. Faith. One of the themes of that book.
Maturity of faith.
Maturity of faith. Coming of age.
He talks all about the rituals of the Catholic faith and what has been pounded into him from childhood. And you're kind of forced, you feel like you're forced into that. And the maturity is, this is how I'm growing a relationship with God. And it's a mature relationship where I'm growing with it and shedding some of the rituals I may not believe in.
I mean, to me, it's such a wonderful thing to think. You know, like, to think of God in terms of the best characteristics of humans, of your friends. To think my God would be part Willie, part Stella, Jesse. I mean, I love that image of taking the best features of the characters in this book, in this novel, and he made that composite his God.
Because those people.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say because those people had become his Savior.
Yeah.
Those aspects of him.
I think that Pat always writes so beautifully about faith. I mean, I'm thinking about the scene from Prince of Tides with the grandfather carrying the cross, and I love everything he writes about faith. I remember him telling me this story once, and you can tell me if this is true or if it was just one of Pat's elaborations, but exaggerated.
Can I wink?
He told me, well, John might know the answer. He told me that while he was at the Citadel, he began to sense that he was losing his faith, and he sort of became in a panic about it and had the chaplain start giving him communion every day in an attempt to get his faith back. And I remember asking him, did it work? And he said, not really.
It's in my exaggerated life.
Okay, is it? I mean, I remember having this conversation, and I couldn't remember reading it, but yeah, you're right, it probably is there. So that did happen. And I don't think he ever really completely lost his faith, but...
Well, and John, I don't know, were you there for the Catherine Seltzer's presentation at the Citadel, when she sort of talks about how he sort of supplanted for a little bit the honor code at the Citadel as his faith, and which is based on the Ten Commandments, basically. And I don't know, if how, but I know that, for me, he was a deeply spiritual person, and whether we didn't talk about it in terms of Catholicism or anything else, it's just, when you sense somebody who loves the other as much as he did, and who also would actively try to diminish himself so he could love the other. To me, that's the best part of faith. I'm trying to think of any. I love the high school principal, Mr. Dawkins. So many scenes with him teaching Pat important lessons. And one of the things, coming of age, you're battling. Who are you going to be? Mother haunted, father haunted. Who are you going to become? You're going to become the person your mother thinks you should be, or the person your father thinks you should be. And he fails. Remember the basketball game where Bull Meacham is drunk and he's running up and down and says, "Get Peanut Abbott, get that kid. He just fouled you intentionally. You won't come home tonight unless you get retribution to this player." So Pat throws him the ball, and Peanut Abbott is surprised he gets it, and he dribbles down the court, and Pat undercuts his legs, and he breaks Pat. Ben Meacham undercuts his legs, and he breaks his arm. And Mr. Dawkins goes into the locker room, and Ben Meacham is crying. And basically says it's one of the worst things he's ever seen. You're off the team. You're no longer playing any high school sports. And he holds him accountable for what he has done. And it's a scene where he has given in to his father, and he knows it. He knows he was wrong, and before Dawkins gets in the room, he's praying to God. He's apologizing to God. But before that, it's such an interesting thing, because before that scene, he's praying before the big game with Peninsula, and he's praying for his success, only his, not the team's, because there's college scouts out there. And so, not a good thing to do. What else? What time are we running into?
We got about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes. So
Tim, one observation I'd make is the pack of dogs.
Yeah.
And the wildness that it somewhat represented, and perhaps even an outlet of the anger that was building up within the various characters through the gray. Is that all imaginary on my part?
Well, yeah, I know. I think he used the natural world all through that book, pretty, through Tumor and through Arabelle, through others, through the Shrimpers. But no, I think that whole scene of the Tumor's love for animals and the loyalty those dogs had to Tumor, I think was really well done and intentional. Before I forget about the passage I just read, they wanted to cut it. They did not want that in the book. I was talking to Catherine Seltzer about this, and Catherine Seltzer said, Ann Barrett said it doesn't fit. It's not a match with the other language in the book. It's too lofty. It's too this, and they wanted to cut it. Pat had gone away for the weekend, and that chapter came in this flourish, and he thought it was the most Woolfian thing he'd ever written. He just really was proud of it. And he, for the first time, fought for a part of it. He didn't take Ann's advice. He fought for it. He fought for it until she kept it. And thank God, I think it's an incredible piece of writing, and I'm so glad he did it.
And it sort of harkens to what would come later too.
Yeah.
I think his writing.
Yeah, it does.
It's better.
It does. Well, I'm a transition a bit to. There's so many things we could talk about, but I want to tell you that I want to read this poem, and then I want to end with Dad's words in this letter. This is an incredible letter. And I want to give it context, but I want to read this poem I wrote about my father. It's called Assurances. It comes to this: will we be all right? A son needs a father to answer. For a few years after the colonel retired from the Marine Corps, he worked as a Pinkerton security cop in Atlanta. During my visits from college, he would drag me along with him on third shift. We would cruise by landing strips of warehouses into the horizon between us. In a loop-the-loop maneuver, he would peer out from a Ford LTD window with an aviator's keen eye, looking for an enemy from the night sky, emerging from a bank of metal buildings, accelerating in North Korea, or from skies over Nam with one hand at 12 o'clock. If he spotted a door ajar, he would hand me the flashlight and bark, "Check it out, Jocko." I would moan half asleep and alert to the danger, hop out, entering darkness, ready to love him, with light shaking, exploring impenetrable places to check for what might still be there. I'd spot men sleeping, smell cheap liquor, former Pinkertons or Marines, I thought. I'd close doors, report that it was all clear. My father would call me a good pussy and say, "There's no assurances in this life." And I'm a sort of give you context. I brought everybody this letter if you want a copy. And this is a letter to understand the impact the Great Santini novel had on my father. He was just livid about it. He was just so furious about it. And what happens in any subsections of family, you had his people, his brothers and sisters mad at Pat, calling Pat, screaming at Pat for writing the book. And there was a real rift, a large rift growing. He kept on telling Dad to finish the book, finish the book. Dad finally did. But he writes this letter. In this letter, you kind of have to read between the lines. It's not, I would say it's a bit disingenuous, because he's sort of trying to thread a needle here about sort of not saying that all this was true, but yet sort of repairing the rift in the family. And he does it in a very articulate, very clever way. This letter is dated May 15th, 1976. To the Magnificent Seven. Let me start my epistle by simply stating that I was deeply touched by your oldest brother's latest literary endeavor. Pat is a very clever storyteller, and I was totally absorbed and encountered every emotion as, reading very slowly his attempt at humor, life with Father unfolded in this work of fiction. It was as though I knew some of the characters personally. Pat did a superb job in developing the character of Mary Ann. Excellent on Ben, Lillian, and Karen. Matt, and with all modesty, fell far short on Santini, which is quite understandable with such a dashing and complex character. My absolute favorite parts, and we mentioned some tonight, not necessarily in order, were 1. Dave Murphy, 2. Mess Night, 3. Tumor Scenes, 4. Our Trip to Beaufort, 5. Bull Goes to the Base, 6. Opening Chapter, Mushroom Soup Incident, 7. Bull and Ben Out to the Recruit Depot, 8. Archaic Word Usage, 9. Mary Ann and Ben Prom Night, 10. Ben's basketball game, including one-on-one. Characters which I enjoyed that were non-family were Tumor, Docus, Lauren, Jim Don, Sphinx, Sammy, Red, and the Hedgepaths, to name a few. But the setting for some was interesting and often amusing. In all honesty, I read the first 100 pages and was furious. At page 222, not that that page is important, I was livid and put the book down. When I resumed reading it, it came easier for me. And now I look back, the writer had me, and many readers will feel much the same in in the palm of his hand. I laughed at some scenes, cried at others, figuratively speaking, of course, and became away a better person having lived with the Beechams. I thought the book was great, and it should make a real terrific flick. But how do you go about the task of telling your son and his family that you are profoundly grateful and extremely proud of his latest literary endeavor, particularly when I fell into his literary trap and could have choked him as often as twice a page early in the book. But he would only say, "Read on, Macbeth, read on." How true. When you're Irish, dumb, and then stupid, it is a series of major obstacles to overcome. Each of you possess an essential quality of greatness that cannot be explained as to the whys and wherefores, but I can only thank the deity for his benevolence. Pat's literary ability has never been excelled as in his plea with God in the last pages of the book. Maybe the reason I was so impressed was that it was in the area of religious discussions that I had my greatest concern and my gravest reservations. All of you should read these words. His informal prayer does pay great honor and glory to our deity. We all take turns rejecting God for one reason or another, but the spirit can never rest until you make your peace with your Creator. And so the hound of heaven shall pursue each of you. To Pat, my oldest son, may you forever wear the cloak of authority, as befitting the eldest Conroy, as a sign to all of our pride, and you as son and brother. And may Barbara and your children have the patience to endure the idiosyncrasies of such a clan. Lovable, likable, Donald Conroy, USMC. Any last questions or comments before we wrap up?
What was his relationship like with his own father?
He was a whore. He was. He was a tough Irish, it was a tough, brutal child. Railroad worker. I think they all suffered. And I think that's the problem with abuse, right? It tends to carry on, and it takes a real effort for that not to happen. Yes?
I know it's time to go, but you were going to talk a little bit about, or maybe Jessica was, about the second act.
Yes.
Of Conroy.
Talk
Did you really
about
become
Dad
as
as-
lovable as we've heard.
Yeah, I was just talking this morning with Kathy and Sandra about the first time we met him, and I was little. He had just been, I guess, come back from being in the military and maybe near his retirement. And he was so intimidating. I cried. I was like 3. But then when he moved to Atlanta, soon after, it was after the divorce or during it, it completely changed him. And it was just interesting hearing that in the letter too. Just that I feel like he learned how to be loved and love others after that, like maybe just the lesson of the divorce. And he was very doting, caring grandfather to Willie as well.
I remember Pat saying that he thinks the divorce kind of shocked him and humbled him in some way. It
Yeah,
never
I mean, he was
occurred to him that
completely
this would
changed.
happen to him.
I mean, he was quite the ladies' man afterwards. We'll get too into that, but there's some great stories about that. But he was very sweet. He always, like, when Dad traveled and he lived abroad for some time, he would take us to the dentist and to Six Flags and, take us around. He was a great grandfather.
One of the things that I forgot to say, and it's sort of just a fascinating thing, in the front of this book, the dedication, if y'all remember, this book is dedicated with love and thanks to Frances Peggy Conroy, the grandest of mothers and teachers. Well, when Pat first was sending this in, he showed this to Helen Harper, and Helen said, "You cannot leave your father out. You were taught better than this." So Pat added the second part, and think how important that is. And to Colonel Donald Conroy, USMC retired, the grandest of fathers and Marine aviators. Think if that would have been left off.
That's just an act of grace on Pat's
Yeah.
part.
Yeah. And the other thing, I like to end this way. In the first part of the opening, I talked to you about how all the expectations were on Pat's shoulders. Well, he never became a Marine aviator, never went to war, never became the Marine my father thought he should be. But what he did was he through writing the truth, by exposing the truth of the abuse, he was able to change Santini's heart. And so therefore, he was Santini's hero. So, thank you.